Welcome to Selected Shorts on CD, Volume 18, Lots of Laughs. Nicholson Baker's story, Subsoil, is read by Thomas Gibson.
For his book-length monograph on the early Harrow, Niall T. Milner, the agricultural historian, decided that he had to pay one more visit to the Museum of the Tractor in Harvey, New York, an inconsequential little town not far from Geneva. He had already been to the Museum of the Tractor 3 times. Each time, he left feeling that he'd learned everything he needed about the rare implements of harrowage and soil pulverization in its collection, sure that his further photos and sketches would suffice. But always there was some tiny question that lured him back. The manager of the Harvey Motel took an interest in Niall's research and wanted him to recall his stay with pleasure. Whenever he came, she used a headier brand of air freshener in his room. Rather than discuss with her his preference for unflavored air, which might make her regret her earlier acts of kindness, Niall decided that for this visit, he would try to stay someplace else and hope she didn't find out. Bill Fipton, who owned and curated the Museum of the Tractor, was at first cagey about recommending a bed and breakfast close by. "There is one that some people go to," he said, thoughtfully eyeing a 1931 Gilroy and Selvo variable impact sod pounder. I don't want to dump on anyone, but I say stick with the motel." Bill, who had been quite friendly to Niall on earlier visits, seemed cooler toward him today. He had been evasive, for instance, about which local hobbyist had done the superior restoration work on one of the more fascinating transitional Uberté harrows. Niall got the sense that Bill, who had a habit of doing something muscular with his tongue before he said anything, apparently to reseat his dental plate, was perhaps beginning to resent how closely Niall was scrutinizing the collection. "Please," Niall insisted, I really need to branch out." "The Tates," said Bill reluctantly. "They'll give you a room." He gave Niall the address. "It won't be cheap, and keep an eye open there. I've heard some stories, but they're supposed to make an interesting soup." Mrs. Tate led Niall up the stairs and down a narrow hall hung with 3 tiny black and white photographs of sliced mushrooms. A cotton runner striped in purple and black ran down the middle of the hall. She opened a door. "This is a surprise," said Niall, taking it all in. He gestured at a tall, tubular brown vase with a single black branch gnarling artily out of it. "It's so spare. I expected cutesy curtains and ruffled bedskirts." "We are not exactly of Harvey," Mrs. Tate said. She was nearly 50, with an attractive, prematurely ravaged neck and an expensive haircut. A bit of what seemed to be a tattoo, possibly the tail of something, peeped out past the unbuttoned neck of her silvery linen shirt. "But we do love the town." "Oh, well, me too," said Niall. "The tractors draw me here as usual. Where tractors are, I must go. But I've grown very fond of Main Street and that sad little chamber of commerce." "And what about dinner?" said Mrs. Tate. "Do you offer a dinner package?" Niall asked. "We could see what we have on hand." "I've heard high tidings of soup," Niall said. "Ah," said Mrs. Tate, coming alive. "Is that what you like?" Niall said he would, very much, being a soup person, if it wasn't too much trouble. Mrs. Tate left him to settle in. He took off his shoes and scattered his new farm machinery sketches on the bed. His monograph was taking far too long to finish. 3 years was excessive, even for a subject as far-reaching as his. Niall was disorganized, a trait surprising in a man so short, and he was having exciting insights now about the evolution of rotary hoe blades and diggers, which he later realized were not new to him, ones that he'd written down in a state of euphoria and lost in his briefcase and forgotten. So much of what he knew was only in his head, unfortunately, and his head couldn't always be depended on. Driving to Harvey, he had briefly wondered whether, were he to die suddenly right then, he would have lived his life, not merely as an agricultural historian, but even as a human being, entirely in vain. He'd seen it happen recently with the late Raymond Purdy, who'd also known a great deal about early silos, more than anyone else on earth. When Purdy was suffocated that muggy April afternoon under 3 tons of raw soy, everyone in Niall's circle had expected at least a partial manuscript to come to light, but sadly, the history of silage had all been in Ray Purdy's head. "This is the last research trip I'll make," said Niall sternly to himself. "From now on, synthesis, exclusion, and sequential paragraphs." A faint smell of furniture wax, and underneath it, of something earthy and wholesome, cheered him. This bed and breakfast in a Greek revival house with 7 thin columns in front was much better for morale than the well-intentioned instant headache of Harvey Motel's air freshener. Maybe the town disparaged the Tates just because the Tates had taste. The room was furnished with extreme, almost oppressive care. The bureau was an ornamentally incised Eastlake-style artifact with a large pair of mother-of-pearl wings inlaid in one side. The bed bore puzzling, ovoid knobs about the size of ostrich eggs on its headboard and footboard. 5 tiny safe deposit box keys hung next to a tarnished mirror as decoration. Niall peered closely at the surface of the wall, fascinated by the stippled effect the Tates had achieved. They appeared to have flung or slapped around lengths of thin rope dipped in cinnamon-colored paint. Risky, Niall felt, but it worked. Only one pillow was made into the bed, an arrangement that momentarily concerned him since he always slept with a second between his legs for comfort, having sensitive knees. But in the closet, 3 spares were neatly shelved. Good, no need to bring up matters of menage with the somewhat intimidating Mrs. Tate. Above the pillows, on the highest closet shelf, Niall noticed a ziggurat of old children's games. There was a game called Mr. Ree and period Monopoly and Parcheesi boxes, and there was also the obvious treasure of the collection, an old Mr. Potato Head kit. "Ho!" he cried, gingerly sliding it from its place on the shelf and carrying it to the bed. He'd played Mr. Potato Head a few times as a child, back in the days before child safety, when you used a real baking potato and you stabbed the facial features fitted with sharp points into it. The joy of the old game came in imposing the stock nose and ear and eyepieces on the unique Gothic shape of a real potato, man and nature in concert, the encrustation of the mechanical upon the organic, or however it was that Bergson defined laughter. The modern Mr. Potato Head, which included an artificial base potato with holes, was, Niall felt, a mistake. Now you merely joined bought plastic to bought plastic in various fixed permutations. Why continue the affectation of a potato at all? He pulled the lid slowly off the box, feeling the air slip in to fill the increasing volume. And then he had a nasty shock. Fully prepared for a quick, happy poof of nostalgia, needing it, in fact, since he was more than a little discouraged by the progress of his research, he was instead confronted by something unpleasant, and even for a moment at least, outright frightening. A real potato, or a former potato, a now dead potato, still rested within the box. The last person who had played with the set had carelessly left the face he had created inside, with its proptotic yellow eyes and enormous red-lipped, toothy, Milton burlesque smile still stabbed in place, and over time, how long Niall didn't want to guess, the potato's flesh had shrunk to a wizened leer of agonized supplication or self-mockery, while it had grown 7 long, unhealthy sprouts that had curved and wandered around their paper chamber, feeling softly for the earth hole they never found. They resembled sparse hair and gastrointestinal parasites and certain weedy, wormy albino things that live underwater. Niall looked on them with disgust. Hurriedly, he replaced the top and stuffed the box away in the closet again. He rested for a moment on the bed, blinking regularly. The expression on the Mr. Potato Head intruded itself several times into his imagination. Mummified, it had seemed, but conscious, in a state of sentient misery. The really disturbing thing was that despite its appliqué grin and hefty comic nose, it had, Niall felt, looked at him with a fixed intent to do him harm. The apparent animosity, though he could discount it as a trick of decomposition, bothered Niall. He'd never been hated by a potato. From downstairs came the cheerful eruption of a blender. Mrs. Tate held a low green bowl over the table, waiting for Niall to remove his politely clasped hands from the placemat. "There," she said, giving the bowl a half-turn as she positioned it in front of him. She sat down across from her husband. Mr. Tate had a carefully sculpted silver beard and wore a soft, formless jacket over a black sweater with 3 brown buttons. The two of them were the least likely bed and breakfast owners Niall had run into in a long time. He turned his attention to his dinner. The soup had a grainy pallor, with parsley shrapnel distributed equitably throughout. Boy," he said, sniffing deeply. "Leek?" Mrs. Tate gave him an 18th century smile. "And potato." "Potato," Niall flinched. On each of his host's plates were 3 dried apricots. Aren't you having any? He asked them. Mr. Tate discreetly slipped an apricot in his mouth as if he were taking a pill and began dismantling it with toothy care. "Oh, we seldom eat soup ourselves," Mrs. Tate explained. She put a light finger on her abdomen. "I'd like to, but I can't. Potatoes upset me now." "Juliet makes the soup for our guests only," said Mr. Tate. "It's labor-intensive. Please start." "Oh, potatoes are not for everyone, that's for sure," said Niall, his mind racing. "Especially, sweet potatoes. I know 5, no, more, 6 people who hate sweet potatoes." Mrs. Tate slipped a disc of apricot in her mouth and sucked on it like a cough drop. "Please start," she quietly hissed. "Pumpkin pie stock is plunged. Don't ask me why," Niall nattered. "I do enjoy a good boiled potato, though, especially mashed up nicely." "Oh, you like them mashed," said Mrs. Tate, with a distant look, as if recalling early felonies. "Please, won't you?" Why was he hesitating? What reason could he possibly have for his sense of vague unease? Suppressing his doubts, the agricultural historian took a big, noisy spoonful, feeling immediately juvenile, as he always did when he ate soup as a guest. "Very nice," he said. Mrs. Tate was pleased. "We're known for it, at least within Harvey." "I'll tell my colleagues," said Niall. By the time he had accepted his second bowl, Niall's doubts and suspicions were altogether gone, and the Tates, who'd been keyed up at first, seemed to relax completely as well. They drank wine and ate their dried fruits and asked Niall informed questions about his field. When he determined that the term rear power takeoff, as applied to the tractor, was not entirely new to them, he grew animated and confessional. As he described his work, he began to think that it was, though obviously influenced, as who could not be, by the insights of Chatterton Goff, Paul U. Selding, and M.J. French, something well worth finishing. He found himself describing to the Tates his recent fears. He sketched the story of Purdy and the terrible soy suffocation, from which the history of spouted beds and other fermentational mechanisms might never fully recover. "I'm feeling unusually mortal at the moment," Niall was finally drawn to say, wiping his mouth and sitting back. His hosts were arranged in casual poses. Slightly more of Mrs. Tate's tattoo was visible. It now looked like part of a vine, perhaps, rather than a lizard's tail. "If I were Keats," Niall went on, and thankfully I'm not, cough, cough, "I would be making every attempt to use the word glean in a sonnet." I hope your stay here will help," said Mrs. Tate, carefully. "Oh, yes, well, although," hesitating briefly, Niall decided that he would probably trust the Tates more if he just went ahead and told them. "An oddly upsetting thing happened in my room just before you called me down. I probably shouldn't have, but I took a quick peek inside the Mr. Potato Head box in the closet." "You opened the box," said Mr. Tate, leaning forward. "I'm a Curious George sort of person," Niall explained. "It's the historian in me. Well, there was this highly unattractive dead potato in there. Not good." Mrs. Tate looked thoughtful. "Douglas Grebe was the one who saw that set last, if I remember right," she said. "He was here visiting the Museum of the Tractor, too, from the University of somewhere. Illinois, was it, Carl?" "Oh, Grebe," said Niall, waving dismissively, "a controversial figure, not universally liked. Well, his potato head has not aged well, and it scared the starch out of me, frankly." Mrs. Tate rose and removed the plates. "Come with me," she said, and led Niall into the green-trimmed kitchen. 2 Yixing teapots in the shape of cabbages were arranged to the right of the vintage porcelain sink. Mrs. Tate bent and opened all the beautifully mitered doors to the cabinets under the counter. In the shadows were 3 rotating storage carousels. Crowded on the round shelves were dozens of silent potatoes. Some were dark brown, some were deep red, some had eyes that looked like bicuspids, some had sprouted and evidently had their sprouts clipped off. A few were extraordinarily large. A smell of earth and rhizomes and of things below consciousness pervaded the room. Niall made a whistle of amazement. Then he said, "1 or 2 of those larger gentlemen do not look particularly recent." "The secret to a good earth apple soup," explained Mr. Tate, squeezing his wife's arm, "is to age the ingredients." Niall sent his sensibility on a little stomach check and then quickly recalled it. All seemed well. "I had no idea," he said. Mrs. Tate bent and gave one of the carousels a turn. She leaned forward and lightly caressed a huge russet. "We eat only the fruit of a plant," she said, "and never its tuber, since its tuber is not something it intended to offer the world." "But," Niall said, indicating the gleaming components of the blender which were upended in the black dish strainer, the blender blade sat drying like a blown rose. You made the soup." "It was our pleasure," said Mrs. Tate. "It was for you." She closed all but one of the doors to the potato cabinets and turned off the light. The only illumination in the room now came from a small bulb within the oven. "At this time of evening, we generally watch Nick at Night," Mr. Tate said, escorting Niall into the front hall. Oh, thanks. I think I'll head up. I've got some more notes that I should expand." "While the Tractor Museum is still fresh in your mind," said Mrs. Tate. "Exactly," said Niall. He waved a cheerful goodnight to his hosts and ascended the stairs, humming. But as he walked down the narrow hallway, paying no notice to the riven mushrooms, he suddenly thought, why did Mrs. Tate use that particular word, that fresh? And could those be potato prints of some kind on the walls of his room? Niall had difficulty getting to sleep that night. The Tates had kindly provided some light reading on a shelf by the bed. Niall got through a short Wilkie Collins story and half of a longer Sheridan Le Fanu. He liked being mildly frightened by fiction when he was uneasy, in fact. When he turned out the light, waiting for sleep to come, he was visited by the memory of the now sinister-seeming black rectangle of the half-open kitchen cabinet downstairs. Why hadn't Mrs. Tate closed the last cabinet door? This was like trying to fall asleep after you remembered that you'd left a radio on in the basement, he thought. And the sheer size of some of those potatoes she'd shown him, they were phenomenal, unnatural, boulders of carbohydrate. Finally, he was able to worm his way into a fairly satisfactory half-sleep by imagining himself tearing up large, damp pieces of corrugated cardboard. He woke some hours later feeling sorry for a minor engineer named Shelby Hemper Fairchild, whose career had been cut short in the early 30s by the unfortunate inhalation of a cotton ball. Fairchild, and not Edward Lyriel, as some wrongly asserted, developed Bleedman and Company's famous gutter snipe, an erratic but groundbreaking turf flail and trencher. Without moving, Niall worked his unpillowed eyeball so as to take in as much of the room as he could. Moonlight furbished the brown cylindrical floor vase and its gnarled branch, as well as an aquarium bibelot in the shape of a ruined arch on his bedside table. He felt strange suspicions and recalled the kitchen cabinet. Big, hostile, pocked things were waiting in there. That cabinet door was open. Wouldn't it be a good idea just to nip quickly downstairs and close it himself? Clearly, he wasn't going to sleep properly until this state of affairs was resolved. Pulling the pillow from between his legs, he put on his paper slippers, hospital wear salvaged from an appendectomy performed several years earlier, and made his way in the half-light toward the door, where he discovered something. A long, glimmering white sprout with violet accents, a lengthy potato sprout by all indications, had grown through the keyhole. It curved motionlessly to the floor. Perplexed, on the verge of being horrified, he glanced at his watch more to steady himself than to check the time. The notion that this sprout had grown its way out of the kitchen cabinet, originating in one of those prodigies of mass storage downstairs, and that it had then worked its way slowly up to him all while he slept, disturbed Niall exceedingly. His watch claimed it was almost 3. "Hello?" he called softly in case someone or something was on the other side of the door. There was no answer. Closer up, the feeler appeared harmless. He touched it quickly, testingly. It was cold and didn't move. He grasped it. He wound it around his trembling finger. He pulled. The soft, unchlorophylled plant flesh gave way against the metal edge of the keyhole, making a tiny rending sound. Carefully, Niall fed the broken mystery frond back out under the doorway. "Out you go," he whispered. He waited for some time, listening. "We have scotched the snake, not killed it," he thought to himself, drawing comfort from the scrap of pentameter. And then, reminded that he had some Scotch tape in his briefcase, he carefully sealed the keyhole. The sensation of the sticky tape on his fingers left him feeling almost brave. It was time to confront the hall. He turned the knob and peered tentatively out. The long, pale petitioner with the torn end receded kinklessly from his doorway into the shadows along the black and purple runner. Niall tiptoed along it to the head of the stairway and looked down, craning his neck to determine the chute's route up the stairs. What he then saw, as his gaze penetrated the grainy obscurity of the front hall, made a terror gong go off in his mind. A dozen or more sinuous emissaries from the kitchen, similar to the first, were just turning the corner from the dining room and beginning to climb toward him. "Good gravy," he gasped, hot-footing it back to his room. "They're out to get me." He slid the bolt and tried to think. The proliferating sprouts, though he suspected that they were up to no good, were none too strong, judging by the one that he'd held. They couldn't push their way past the taped-up keyhole, but he had to take reasonable measures to protect himself. If he stuffed something under the door, he theorized, these hellish hawsers would never find him. He took off his pajama bottoms and wedged them into the space between the door and the floor. Immediately, he felt much better. No, they were not strong sprouts. They were not robust. They were attenuated and colorless and slow and soft. That was what he didn't like about them. In fact, that and that they seemed in their blind, tentative way to want to find him. 10 minutes went by, 12. Niall craved to know how fast they were growing, if they were growing at all. Maybe they had withdrawn. Maybe they were already at the top of the stairs. Did they grow only while he slept? In that case, he had to stay awake all night. A watch pot never boils. Or else, were they already nudging gently against the pajama bottom buffer? And if so, would such insistent pushings finally dislodge it entirely? He wheeled around, looking for some backup. A drawer. One of the big, heavy lower drawers from the ornamental bureau. He seized its two handles and pulled. Again, he heard a soft rending sound, louder this time. The drawer was not empty. Inside was a plastic sack of enormous aging Valley Star potatoes, the biggest Niall had ever seen. Through the ventilation holes of the plastic had grown a horror whirl of intertwining white shoots and root hairs. Some of the shoots bore new, radish-sized dark tubers. The upper surface of the conjoined growth was flat like a Jackson Pollock, having encountered the plane of the drawer above. Freed and slightly injured, the bureau's brood now began to awaken. Niall stared for an instant at their sullen stirrings. Then he reverse salaamed, barking once with shock and revulsion. When he moved, his ankle bone made contact with something more yielding than an electrical cord. He glanced down. A gap in the baseboard molding had allowed entrance to more questing feelers from downstairs. There seemed to be some wispy activity at the window. Something was floating up through a loose floorboard. Niall stamped on the board, severing the fiendish sucker. Grabbing his briefcase, he backed slowly across the room. "Mr. and Mrs. Tate?" he quavered. There was no answer. Sensing his movements and his noise, the sallow Stollins began a languorous, low creep toward him. He could see them move now. "No, you're disgusting," he cried, flicking at them with his fingers. His back bumped against the closet door. "I'm doomed," he thought. And then maybe they feared light. If he could get in the closet and turn on the closet light, maybe they would rethink and withdraw. He bumbled inside and shut the door. He yanked on the light cord, which sprang away from his hand. A coruscation of bulb yellow filled the space. He waited, squinting, wishing he were wearing his pajama bottoms. A minute or two passed, and he began to think he was safe. And then he heard sounds from the room. His overnight bag seemed to be on the move. Softnesses were sweeping the walls. He spotted the tips of 3 or 4 lissome elongations peeping under the door. With a terrified, saliva-rich curse, he grabbed a dark green rubber boot and began pounding their growth tips as they emerged. But the light seemed to stimulate them, and now many vied for entrance. Was there no escape? He looked up. Past the light bulb, which was mounted on the wall, he saw a trap door. It must lead to an attic space. He would climb up there, kick out an attic window, climb out onto the porch roof, shimmy down one of the front columns, and run. He grabbed 2 clothes hooks and started to hoist himself up toward the closet ceiling. His eyes drew even with the top shelf. From inside the Mr. Potato Head box came a leisurely scrabbling. Its top began to lift. The Pachisi game slid to one side. The Monopoly game tumbled. The fixed orange eyes of the dead and shrunken Mr. Potato Head appeared from under the rising top. And then 1 or 2, 4, 7 limply questing spud spawn veered into the air toward Niall's face, root hairs a-quiver. "Help!" Niall wailed as he fell. The floor of the closet was a squirm. Whitish-purple growth enveloped him. He waved his arms and plucked at himself hectically, but the soil-starved delvers were persistent. When they touched his face, he began to feel sad that he would never finish the history of the harrow. A sprout grew smoothly into his right knee, seeking his synovial fluid. Several more penetrated his elbows. These hurt quite a lot, though not nearly as much as the one that found its way into his urethra. One wan ganglion discovered his ear canal and another a tear duct, and Niall began to hear only the dim lull pulsation of plant hormones and potato ideology. Let it go, he thought, let it all go. They found the roots his blood took, and they followed these deeper. By dawn, they had grown the fresh, lumpy tuber. that burst his heart. What once was Nile woke in a very dark place. Many Krebs cycles had passed. Many more would pass. He felt himself being slowly turned. His fellows were dozing by the dozen near him. A child's voice was saying, "That one, that big one." He was lifted and cradled in a child's gentle hand. His vision wasn't working properly. He saw several different views of the world. The child, with a cry of happiness, plunged the fake nose into Niall's crisp body flesh. Niall screamed, but it was a potato scream. Below the hearing of all but tree stumps and extinct volcanoes. The child stabbed in the orange pop eyes and then the big red smiley mouth and the little black pipe. Each face piece had points. The child wasn't sure what it wanted. It rearranged the potato head features several times. Niall leaked a little from his puncture wounds. The child grew bored and put Niall back in the box, tossing the unused face parts in after. Then there was a long, dark time. He felt himself shrinking, and the shrinking was agony. He forgot what he'd known. He began to know only what potatoes know. He sensed the changes of geothermic pressure. He heard the Earth's slow resentments. He exhausted himself doing the only thing he could do, which was trying to send out underground shoots to form more potatoes like himself. But the shoots were hindered by a dry, smooth plant product that Niall dimly remembered as cardboard. Niall's face collapsed and partially liquefied, an uncomfortable process he did not soon wish to repeat. As moon followed moon, he felt long suffering, and then he forgot how to feel long-suffering and began to feel a crude and curious misanthropy. When his dark chamber moved, and when suddenly tumbling, he was swarmed with light prickles that reached down to the few places in his starchy interior that still lived, he made out a looming human face and saw it recoil. There was an exclamation of fear, which pleased him. "It's vile," he heard the face say. "Ah." Soundlessly chuckled the thing that once was Niall. "It's another historian of agricultural technology." Emboldened by the fresher air, he readied his pale tentacles for the final gleaning, waiting for nightfall.